Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for being here. So I'm delighted to be with you today. So we've got just over an hour, and we're going to do a little bit of breakout as well. We'll have at least one breakout, maybe two, really depending on how the conversation goes. And the aim of the session really is to invite you to start thinking about sustaining change, and also for some of you to do a tiny bit of a recap about the thinking environment. I know some of you are using that quite actively in your meetings. So this is about building agility and resilience to benefit you, your people, and your business. So Jane has offered to do the slides for me. So Jane, next slide, please. So as you arrive in the chat box, please just tell us in just a few words, maybe a change in your business that you're considering making, currently dealing with, anticipating, or not even anticipating, just to get you starting to think about change. We'll have a look at what comes in the chat. Oh, wow. Expansion of premises and staff. Yep. A change in place, which is... okay. So a relationship change is coming up with another company, partnering with another company. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. When you change the jigsaw puzzle around, you've got to find a way to put it all back together. When you hire, so again, similar, fitting somebody in and fitting in around that new person. Let's see, anything else coming up? So keep those coming, because we might get some more as I'm chatting. So we've got Pete and James currently writing, so we'll come back to those and have a look.
Question control, good morning, may I help you?
Hi, is that Dave?
Speaking.
Oh, could somebody go on?
I will. I'll mute
Sorry,
him.
where?
IBB Law?
How are you doing? You well?
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, Dave says we're constantly changing. Nothing is ever as good as it could be. Wow, lovely. Love the striving for change. So Jane, next slide, please. So this is what we'll do today. We'll have a welcome and an introduction, and I'll run through the thinking environment, just our chosen way of being here together. We'll look briefly at living in a VUCA world, which is a term I'm sure that many of you will have come across before, and what it means to sustain change. And we'll look at some of those elements of change and what a business and a person and a leader and a team needs to be: agile, adaptable, and resilient. And then we'll touch briefly on the inner development goals, because they give us some indications of the kinds of changes that many organizations are looking at in their leaders. And I'll talk a bit about those. And then we'll take a deep dive into one particular aspect, which is something that's relatively new to me, but it's got me fascinated about how people manage change and how people manage various projects. And we'll look at polymaths, monomaths, and philomaths. And we'll have a break thinking pair about those. And then we'll look into what are those traits. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll see why I've included this particular aspect. I've taken a lens on this one. And then we'll look at some questions for you to take away, because I know that you'll continue the conversation after today. And then appreciations and close. So, oh great, we've got two people looking to register as B Corp. Well, you'll learn a lot more about the development goals through that process. Next slide, please, Jane. So just to recap, these are the 10 components of the thinking environment. These were discovered over a period of around 30 years, based on observation from Nancy Klein at Time to Think and other colleagues. And at the heart of those is the concept of attention. I'm not going to go through all 10 today, but hopefully you've got enough familiarity with them to understand what we actually mean by creating a thinking environment where people can think well for themselves and as themselves. And neuroscience is beginning to actually show us an awful lot more about why these are so important and how these all fit together. 30 years ago, we thought, oh, that's interesting. When you give someone attention, they think better. And now neuroscience is taking over almost, that we now understand, oh yeah, when you get attention, this is what's happening in your brain. So it's always nice when your ideas are sort of proven right by theories later on. So these 10 components all come together to form a great system for independent thinking in all of us. And that the main thing is that we think better when we're given these 10 components. So next slide, please, Jane. And if you can click one after the other, that would be great. So it started with an observation. Next slide, please. And the observation is the quality of everything we do depends on the quality of the thinking we do first. Next slide. Good thinking results in good decisions and actions. And the way that we behave as listeners with people has more impact on the quality of their thinking than their IQ, their prior knowledge, or their experience. And I'm guessing that some of you will have experienced this for yourselves when you're doing your thinking pairs. Some people call them 5-5s, that when someone gives you their full attention and is easeful and is encouraging and is interested in what you're saying and what you might be about to say next, you think better. And you'll probably also know that the way that we behave with ourselves when we're trying to give ourselves attention and we're trying to read a book or work on a paper, or work on anything at all, if we're not giving focus, then it's very, very hard to do. And I don't know if you're the same, but I've found it increasingly hard over the last few years to study a book for any period of time. I have to put a timer on now and make sure that I sit and I don't have my phone in the same room. It's been quite a discipline, because otherwise there's just so many things going on around that. And next clip, please. And so the key to this is giving someone sustained generative attention. And we think that what might be happening is that when we're in a state of attention and we're giving our full focus to somebody, then what it effectively does is reduce our threat response. So we're not panicking that they're going to do something or say something or interrupt us with a bit of an assault on our thinking. We can ease much more into our own thinking. And that quietens an area of the brain called the amygdala, which you may have come across in terms of emotional hijacking. So I think when you create these conditions, it's almost like creating an element of psychological safety, which I'm sure you've covered. So sustained generative attention, and you're going to see why later on attention is becoming so much more important for leaders under times of great stress and change, and if we're going to sustain ourselves and our organizations. Next slide, please, Jane. So we define attention as listening without interruption and with interest in where the person will go next in their thinking. And as you can see, these two puppies here have a great incentive. It's probably food. But if we can give someone that kind of attention and give ourselves that kind of attention in a way, when we're trying to focus, we will think better, we will make better decisions, and that will result in better outcomes. So that's what I'd like you to hold in your mind today, is how you give attention to yourself and to others. Next slide, please. And if you could click all 4 of those, that would be great. So you've probably heard the term VUCA. It's been throwing around for about 20 years now. So it looks like change is well and truly here to stay. And those elements of VUCA are volatility. The change is quite rapid and unpredictable. COVID was a great example of that. I'm sure you draw on that a lot in your conversations. That change can be really rapid, and we don't know what's going to happen. 50, 100 years ago, our minds and our businesses worked in very different ways. We worked on production lines, we worked on set numbers, we knew what was likely to happen. But the geopolitical environment that we're now in, the global supply chains that we work with, we don't know what's going to happen in one country millions of miles away that could affect what we're doing today. We don't know what's happening in the environment that's going to change. We don't know what's happening in workforce, and certainly, as COVID showed, we don't know what's actually happening in health terms, for example. So uncertain, the present may be quite unclear actually, so people are having to grapple a lot with uncertainty now and uncertainty in the future. And we know through those of you that have done the SCARF model, the status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness, that these 5 elements are really important conditions for human beings to thrive. when we've got a sense of who we are, what's going to happen next, what our role is, those kind of things, that we do think better and make better decisions. So we're dealing with a lot more certainty. Complexity. Things are different now. Things aren't linear. Things are multiply connected. They're attached. We're having to learn to think in webs rather than in lines. And things that I said, they're all connected with volatility. One thing that happens here, something happens elsewhere, and it can cause chaos and confusion. And things are ambiguous. In the past, things might have been clear-cut, decisions were clearer-cut. Now we've got so many different factors in a changing world to take account of. It's very often very difficult to know what's to do, what's the best thing to do. So this is the new normal, the VUCA world, the new normal, and I'm sure many of you are thinking about things that you've had to deal with in the last few months that you could apply that VUCA to, and add to that personalities, including marketplaces, consumer behavior, as I said, supply chains, all sorts of things, rents going up, financial crises, you name it. We're dealing with VUCA. Very different position perhaps than our forefathers, our parents, our grandparents, who had a lot more stability and certainty in their lives. Next slide, please. So how do we sustain change? Well, when we think of sustaining change, often the books and the articles that I was looking at, we're talking about keeping a change going. You've introduced a new process. How do you keep that process going? You've moved to a new field. How do you keep that growth going? But in a way, it's a bit of an oxymoron, because change is not sustainable, because it's just change. So that giving any living system, change is constant. Perhaps we need to see it as sustaining the capacity to initiate or adapt to change. Such as this tree here. This tree hasn't sustained change. This tree has changed its capacity. It's had probably different creatures coming to chew on it when it was a sapling. It's had different weather temperatures. It's had all sorts of different elements to deal with. It's probably had people and animal and creatures walking over it. It's got a different environment. It might have toxins in its environment. So somehow this tree has had to learn to keep its roots firmly there and adapt to the change. And plants adapt to change just like we do. They just don't necessarily move, but they do adapt all the time. So maybe that's what we need to look at now, is how do we sustain that capacity when this change is relentless and constant and coming from multiple directions. Next slide, please. And you've probably heard the terms agility and adaptability. Well, if you look at this person walking across this ravine, you can just about see them on this rope. We don't know if that person's chosen to be there or not. They might have initiated this. They might have said, well, actually, what I really want to do is I want to walk across this ravine. I'm going to set myself a goal to walk across that. So you could say, well, that person's been quite agile. They've been proactive and opportunistic. They thought they were going to do this, so they've initiated it. They probably trained for it, and so they're acting on this. So to be agile, you also need to be adaptable to what's going on around, because this person's potentially made the choice. So we could see that really as a proactive. And then when we come to adaptability, next click, please. It could be seen as defensive and responsive to pressures of survival, open to external changes. I mean, the two terms are interchangeably used. Lots of different books will have different definitions, but for me, this feels more accurate, that agility is going for it and saying we're going to do this because this is what we want to do, strategically we want to do. And adaptability is often reacting when something else has happened, and you're then taking a defensive stance. And how do I, as a leader, respond to this? How do we as a business respond to it? And you can be adaptable without being agile. You just might end up having to, just adapt to what's going on. It doesn't mean to say that you've been particularly proactive. Next slide, please. And as Margaret Heffernan says, you're a great writer. And if you don't know Margaret Heffernan, she's an American management consultant and writer who's written some amazing works about being a leader, about being prepared for future, and charting a new future for leaders. And so she's done a lot of research around change. And she knows that the way that change is going now, we just don't know what it will always look like. So we can't always plan for it, but we can prepare and build resilience for a range of outcomes. And she did some work with the Centre for Epidemiological Studies way before COVID. And she realised that organisations and countries that are prepared for things like COVID tend to have around 10 different things lined up that they can draw on in case this big thing happens, whatever this thing is. And the organisations and countries that weren't as adapted, that weren't ready for it and hadn't been proactive, were scrabbling around trying to find one solution. And of course, all of that has a cost. You know, to develop 5 or 6 or 7 or more different medicines that may never be used requires an awful lot of money in research and development. Whereas if you're going to be resilient, we have to treat being prepared as important as planning. And that was a big lesson for her. And she wrote a book called Uncharted, How to Map the Uncertain Future, which is really, really worth a read, and some great TED Talks on change and people management. And next slide, please. So what does she mean by resilience? What do we mean by resilience? Well, it's a term that's bandied around a lot. And the difficulty I do have with sometimes it implies that everybody has to be resilient and it's all your fault if you're not. It doesn't really take into account the fact that environments need to be resilient for us. We need to create those too. But if we look at it as a personal quality, and we will be looking at that as a personal and an organisational quality in a moment, is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties. So it's toughness. Some people call it mental toughness. It's also about adaptable in terms of being elastic, to spring back into shape. So this begs the question of how do leaders need to be to rise to the challenges and be resilient and sustain the capacity to do so. So there's a big tall order. Next slide, please. Well, I'm just going to briefly introduce the inner development goals, and I've got some links for you to read afterwards, and it may be something you choose to have a look at yourself. And those of you going for B Corporation status will get to know a lot more about these. The Sustainable Development Goals, which are the sister really of the IDGs, are 17 goals for sustainable living and developed by the United Nations. And they cover all sorts of things like food security, land security, water security, decent employment, happy people, thriving communities. So they cover 17 specific goals. And they're really aimed at tackling some of the world problems around scarcity, shortages, climate change, environmental damage, those kind of things. And the SDGs were developed many years ago, and yet one could say, well, if they were developed many years ago and they were issued by the United Nations, why aren't we in a better state on our planet than we are? Why are we still in such a series of repeated crises? Some would call it a meta crisis. And they started looking at what it was the leaders of organizations were and were not doing. And a very large group of researchers, mostly from Sweden, started looking at what are the leadership qualities that we need our world leaders, our country leaders, our business leaders to have if we're going to lead sustainably and develop themselves in a sustainable way and develop their capacity to make change happen and the capacity to keep taking on change. And they came up with these 5 areas, and we're not going to take a deep dive to them today, but there are just 5 clusters, and one could call them competencies. It's a new form of leadership competencies. And typical of management consultants, it's got lots of words in there that don't really make an awful lot of sense to everyday folk, like being, relating to self. You know, what does that really mean? I run a small business in wherever, and what does being, relating to self mean? But I'll just talk through those briefly. So it's about being is about having an inner compass, you know, knowing what's right and true for you, knowing what your values are. It is about acting with integrity and authenticity, about being open and having a learning mindset, about being self-aware of your impact on others, of your impact on the world, and about having personal presence as a leader. Thinking are the cognitive skills about being able to think critically, to not make decisions without thorough thought, with being able to question in this day and age of so much information flying at us with fake news, AI. Yeah, how do we know what's real and true for us? It's about being able to manage complexity. It's about learning to think like a spider's web, having awareness of all those parts of the web, and that gives us perspective skills, and from that able to make sense of a bigger picture, and having then that long-term orientation and visioning rather than the small short-term production line end of day thinking. And then relating and caring to the others for the world is about having an appreciation, and you'll know this from the thinking environment, the impact that appreciation can do on someone's thinking and in fact on your own. So caring for others in the world and feeling connected, a sense of connectedness, whatever we do in the world impacts somebody or something else. And we may not see that, but there's no such thing as a cheap product, really, is it? Because someone somewhere has paid a price for it, or something somewhere has paid a price when we get a bargain. And having humility, knowing our place in the world and feeling humbled by nature, and having empathy and compassion. And then there's collaborating and social skills, which is about communicating. And I'm sure many of you have been on your own journeys about how you communicate as your leadership role has evolved. And co-creation skills, bringing people in with you, bringing those skills together so that the sum is greater than the parts. Having an inclusive mindset. Many of you will be working on inclusivity in your firm, and bringing more diverse thinking in, and having intercultural competence in this mixed world that we have now, awareness of what it means for different people, for different types of groups to be part of your organization beyond in your supply chain. Those social skills extend to the ability to build trust and to mobilize people when times are tough. And finally, on their acting, you've got acting and driving change, which is the proactive side of being agile, which is having courage and creativity and a sense of optimism and perseverance, even when times get tough. So these 5 areas, they sound fairly superhuman-like, don't they? To have all these qualities, to be able to hold all of this complexity, all of these things in mind. So how on earth do you go about beginning to be this kind of leader and having this kind of organization? Some people are already probably there. Some people are hearing this and saying, well, I've identified already in my development plan, I need to work on my ability to do this and to do that. So next slide, please. So incisive questions are one of the components of a thinking environment, which is the ability to look at an issue, to realize that we're making assumptions about something, and often they're not true, but we're living them like they're true, and then replacing them with something that's truer and liberating. And the reason this is important here is that when I started looking at inner development goals, I realized actually this is something very different being demanded of leaders than when I started in leadership development 30 years ago. It was much more about the ability to define a strategy, plot a course, stick to it, and all of those kind of things. And it was looking at the things like this difference between leaders and managers. But now we're thinking, well, if this is what we've got to be like, what do we need to be instead? If this is what this VUCA world is calling on us. And the link came for me about the next stage, which is I'm going to talk to about polymath, is a conversation I had with somebody a few years ago, and I was chatting to them. They don't even know me terribly well, but I said, you know what I'd love to have done in my life, which I haven't done. I would love to be an absolute specialist in one thing. I'd like to have written books on this. I'd like to have done some really in-depth, meaty research, and I'd like, to have done that. But what I tend to do is I like this and I like that. They're all related, and sometimes they're not actually, but I like to take a deep dive at this, and I can get lost in that, and I can go down rabbit holes, and I love research, but I also like delivery, and sometimes I just wonder what it would have been like if I'd, been able to really focus on just one thing. And the person who hardly knows me said, well, you're a polymath, aren't you? And I was a bit embarrassed. And I said, oh, no, I'm not a polymath. I said, I'm not a genius. She said, no, that's not what a polymath is. Oh, what is it then? And she said, well, it's the ability to have a number of things on the go that you get good at, that you can take a deep dive in one thing, that you can really get into subject at great depth, but then you might get into a very different subject at equally great depth. And you might have several things on the go, all at depth, but you'll swap and change between them. And it was quite a liberating thing to hear, because I then said, oh, well, because I've been assuming that I was a jack of all trades and a master of none. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Well, if I knew that I was a polymath, then I'd accept that. And I'd start thinking, okay, what else can I learn? What else can I learn? Instead of thinking, oh, I really want to go on that course or read that book, but I've really got to focus on this thing. So it was probably, it was one of my more liberating moments in my life, because I'm a polymath. And I didn't want to earn the term because it felt rather hubristic. It felt rather arrogant. I'm a genius. But once I realized it's not about a genius, it's about the way that people can think and act on that. Because the word polymath tends to bring up characters from history like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most quoted polymaths. He could do things at genius level. But I then realized, well, if I don't have to be a genius at everything, what might that be like instead? Next slide, please. So there's three different ways of looking at it. There's a monomath, a person who has deep expertise in a particular area, a real specialist. And I'm guessing that some of you may have been attracted to the kind of business you do because you do know what you're doing in that, or you decided you would learn. And it might have been something that you were quite good at and continued to build on or quite interested in. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Many people are very successful at being monomaths. Next click. And a polymath is a person with broad, comprehensive knowledge and skills about many different subjects. And it just doesn't necessarily mean jacks or jills of all trades and master of none. You can develop mastery in one thing and then go on to another. Next click, please. And a philomath or a philomath, I've not yet found out how to say it. Different people say it differently. Someone who loves learning and studying just for its own end. And I identified with this, and polymaths are also generally philomaths, but some philomaths focus on mastery of one subject. So the question is to ask yourself, do you love learning? Do you absolutely love learning? Well, my guess is, as you're a member of Peer Engage, you probably came on here to learn. Hopefully you've been enjoying the experience. So let's just think, and I think we've got a breakout coming now. I'm just going to move my slides on just to do that check. I think this was the point at which I thought we'd have a breakout. To invite you, or is it maybe, oh yeah, so sorry, next slide please, one more slide. So there are three dimensions of polymaths, and there's a great book by somebody I found on LinkedIn who's written a book called Why Polymaths. So click first, please. So it's showing a breadth of interest in an eclectic mix of subjects. So it's showing depth and it's showing integration. So having this 3D mindset, really, 3D connected mindset, knowing that there's a variety of things out there that could be of interest to you. So you're constantly learning, being interested in going into some detail. So you're not just glimpsing over the surface, and that you have some ability to integrate these ideas together. And these all bring these IDGs together, of course. So it's the ability to make connections between what seems like disparate knowledge, and importantly for your business is to integrate and innovate new paradigms and perspectives. So this is a fairly tall order, you might think, but it's probably one of the things, in my view, what leaders are going to need to do more of, to develop more ability. I'm not saying be a polymath like me. I've not even been diagnosed as one, but I'm just inviting you to think about, am I stretching myself enough? what are some of the things I need to do if I'm going to continue to be capable of change and to be agile. So I'm going to, now next slide please. So I'm going to invite you to thinking pairs and have 5 minutes each way. To invite you to think, are you a polymath? Or is someone in your team or personal circle one? Just have a conversation to make this real for you. And you might want to consider, how can you spot one? What characteristics might they have? And what's it like being one? And finally, are there any downsides? So we'll do 5 minutes each way. In fact, I think we could do a little bit. We could do 5 minutes each way and a little bit of a dialogue. So 5 minutes of dialogue. So 5 minutes of a thinking pair. That's 10. And then 5 minutes of a dialogue. And if you then come back and share, that would be great. And I think we've got the meeting rooms planned for us. Will somebody be able to go into the meeting rooms after 5 and ask people to swap over?
We'll just have to...
Yeah, sorry, I think if it's okay, we'll just open the meeting rooms for 10 minutes and then sort of everyone, I've set up the pairs, and if everyone can sort of keep an eye on the time and look after 5 minutes to do that.
Did you want it 15 minutes, Linda?
15 minutes would be great. So
15,
is everyone here clear about what a thinking pair is? Yep, great. 5 minutes each way, not interrupting, giving the other generative sustained attention. And then dialogue is having a conversation that goes backwards and forwards without interrupting. So 5 minutes of thinking for yourself with the other listening to you, and then swap round and you listen to the other, and then 5 minutes of conversation. And can we keep that question or post that question in the chat box for people so that they can see that? Are you a polymath or is someone in your circle one? What we'll then do is we'll come back and we'll just invite some comments, and then I'll look at some of the other qualities of polymaths and see how that matches up with some of your thinking. Welcome back. I would love to just spend a couple of minutes just hearing some people's thoughts. Can we unmute people, or can they unmute themselves?
Yeah.
And any thoughts about the question or about your experience of the conversation? Are you a polymath, or do you know someone who's one, and upsides, downsides, what you see?
I'll go. Like, me and Josh are talking, and we're not convinced that a monomath exists. Based on everything we thought of, we couldn't come up with an example that definitely was really, really specific to being a monomath, apart from if you considered yourself it. But we I don't know, we got a bit lost in the weeds about that at the end. So I don't know if anyone else came to the same conclusion.
Tom, see, my husband is a monomath. Quite literally, he does one specific job, and it's the same thing day in, day out, and he doesn't have the ability to do anything else.
That's
like literally, like I think I was saying to Lou that being in business and running your own business, or you have to be good at everything. Communication, you have to be good at a bit of marketing. In my business, I have to be good at all of my products. In Lou, Lou's sort of in her marketing, she has to be good at digital, online, offline, in space, on wherever it is that she's doing her marketing. She has to be good at all mediums, and she has to be able to communicate that through. And I think being in business, you do that. But when you are in one specific job, so he does timetabling for Transport for London. That's what he does. That's what he does every day. There's literally nothing else.
Well,
so
there is. It does exist.
It does exist. It does exist.
But is he choosing to do that? That's another thing we were talking about. Is like, so have is he chosen to be that? Like, would he prefer to have more of a variety?
No, he's brilliant at it. He's brilliant at it. It's the most boring job on earth. You'd poke your eyes out, Tom. You would literally poke your eyes out if you had to do that job. But he loves it, and he's great, and he gets all the big projects, but the projects are the same. The name of the project might change, but all he's doing is changing a timetable. That's all he's doing.
Oh.
And it's the same format, day in, day out, doing different things. The Queen dies, suddenly has to do a different timetable and just organise that. But it's still just a timetable. The reason doesn't change. Olympics comes in, different timetables, still a timetable.
Wonderful example. Wonderful example.
There you go.
Thank you for that. Any other thoughts?
But what about keeping you happy, Sharon? Surely that's another thing he works hard at.
Oh, come on, Dave. You know that's a full-time job for a specialist. Just
Wonderful. Anyone else? Anyone else want to comment or ask a question?
Just to be a devil's. Sorry. No, you go. You go. I was just going to say, just to be a devil's advocate, Sharon. Although he is doing the same thing again and again, doesn't he need lots of different skills to enable him to do that? Because surely, if it wasn't a really complex task, then anyone would do it, or AI would do it, or So
it's
surely
it's just the same complex task is the difference, Emma. Whereas your task will be different every day. His is the same challenge, no different.
Okay. Because we were discussing is creating a bathroom, a monomath job, because our bathroom tradesmen, they can plumb, they can tile, they can decorate, they've got to interact with customers. Is that a monomath job? Because they are producing bathrooms, and next week they'll produce another one.
Surely what you're describing there is somebody that's on the autistic spectrum. Someone that becomes very fixated on an individual thing and focuses on an individual thing to the exclusion of everything else.
Okay, well, actually, we're going to talk about that because that is something that is very interesting in the research that comes out. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to looking at some of these traits. So next slide, please, Jane. So the key traits. So there's a psychologist in polymathy. There's a whole thing called polymathy. Says people with strong polymathic traits have 5 standout features. Probabilistic thinking, that's they gather multiple sources of information, they sort it and they make better predictions. So they might be a bit of a curator and they think, well, that might probably happen. Plasticity, this ability to switch fluidly between courses of action according to circumstances. So this is actually developing new neural networks. And as you might know from some of the other stuff you've been doing, cells that fire together wire together. So you do something and then you do it again and you do it again and you do it again, or you feel it again and you feel it again and you feel it again. That's why people are frightened of spiders, because they learned many years ago that spiders were frightening. They kept using the same neural pathway to go like that. So there are treatments now that get people to block the neural pathway, go down that pathway instead. Suddenly no fear of spiders. So plasticity. Sustained attention, having mental endurance, determined focus, and better completion. So I've got if I'm down a rabbit hole, I'll take a deep dive and I'll completely focus for hours and hours and hours and hours, and I've got to come up from the depths of the ocean, thinking I've completely forgotten what I was going to do. So this is sustained attention, and I will always complete. I'm not perfect, by the way. It's just these are some of my traits. Next one, please. And what's called a dopaminergic system. Well, dopamine is one of those feel-good hit hormones. So people with strong polymathic traits are quite keen on trying out new things because they like the thrill of that. They get a dopamine hit, and they don't have anxiety as a blocker. So they're not necessarily as full as assumptions about, oh, this won't work, I can't do it. There's often a kind of, you might say, even a more optimistic mindset of, I'll give this a go. How hard can it be kind of mentality. And finally, the preference for novelty. Again, endorphins give rewards. So we keep making novel neural connections and keep gaining knowledge. Next slide, please. You'll have copies of these slides, by the way. So the obstacles, well, we'll take these one at a time. And it was the first one Elizabeth mentioned, actually, when we were chatting in the breakouts. The way that our schooling works is you're shown to be good. You get good at one thing, or you're told to be good at one thing, and you are told to stick with it. So if you were good at maths early on, then you might do maths GCSE. Well, in fact, you all would do. And then you might go on to do A level, and then you might go on to your university. So we're constantly shaving off neural pathways in a way by forcing us down these pathways. And that could have been very useful at some points in humankind's history. But it's leading us towards specialization. It's just perpetuated by the systems we live in. And I was just telling an example of a friend of mine that used to do survey work for me. She used to number crunch all my staff survey stuff. But she always came, well, and I noticed in more recent years, she was sending beautiful documents. And I said to her one time, I love the way that you not only crunch the numbers so well, but you also present the documents beautifully. And she said, well, that's because I've just discovered I could paint. And throughout school, she'd been forced down a mathematical route. She trained as an accountant. She ran a survey company. And then one day she decided she could paint. And she started painting. She's now a full-time artist. And I've got one of her pieces of art above my cooker. And when someone says, that's a beautiful painting, and I'll say, that was done by a mathematician. and she lost herself in it. And it was because her parents wanted her to be good at maths. Next bullet, please. So the cognitive biases we are preloaded with cognitive biases. We develop them throughout life. They're shortcuts to help us make decisions. And this is really very important for leaders under times of stress. We use lots of cognitive biases because we've got to get things done quickly. So I know what I'm doing here, familiarity. Let's get this done quickly. Let's get speed. That's the simplest route forward. Let's do that. What's the least effort we can make? And this is what I already know, so I'm going to be biased towards that. There's 145-ish cognitive biases that researchers have identified, and many of them are unconscious. So it's hard to overcome those because they're so strong, and they're strong when we're under great pressure. So for a good leader, really, to start thinking about what are the cognitive biases I've got. And then there can be some untrue limiting assumptions like mine, underpinned by fear. Let's have the first one. Thanks, Jane, which is not having experience or skill beyond our existing expertise. I could never do that. I'm not good at that. Sometimes it's linked to being perfectionistic, or sometimes imposter syndrome. Next bullet point, losing status, identity, or power. There can be an awful lot of power related to being a monomath. The expert, Fred knows what he's doing. Let's do that, especially when others defer or respect us. So who would want to lose that and suddenly become, to be called a jack of all trades is sometimes a bit of an insult, isn't it? You're not really good at anything. But if we reframe that as actually, I can develop my polymathic tendencies. Thirdly, becoming or being seen as a meddler or a micromanager in other people's roles, is very hard sometimes to be a leader and not meddle too much at the basic level of what someone's doing, because you've got an interest in it. So leaders often had to learn to step right back, not get involved in the detail. So developing polymathic tendencies or skills means holding that balance much more, much more in mind. When am I showing interest? When am I meddling? How do I know that? And how do I get people to tell me? And then the next bullet point is having the time, confidence, and energy to learn something new. We're all under such terrific pressure. So, when your back's against the wall, your feet are to the fire, now may not be the time to take up a new hobby or to say, actually, I'm going to think today about what new skill I'd like to develop. So these are all potential obstacles that can arise. And the next slide, please. So what are the benefits? Well, polymaths tend to be able to see the big picture and the potential consequences of a decision much more easily because of this 3D mapping they can do. Humans are pattern-making, sense-making creatures, and if we can begin to think of our patterns in 3D more, we'll have much more adaptability to handle complexity better, just handle that better. We'll be able to think of the consequences of our actions and our decisions. It improves our attention span and gives us more states of flow. Years ago, I went in Buckinghamshire, I went on a upholstery course. I'd never done anything like it. So I was at school. I hated needlework at school. I hated the needlework teacher. Couldn't sew for toffee. Went on an upholstery course. Couldn't believe what it was like to be in that state. Totally absorbed. We did forget to eat. We forgot to take lunch breaks. We were completely engrossed in our hands because I think with my head. we are then also more resilient and able to ride the waves and absorb the shocks that come to us if we can develop those agility tendencies when unexpected change happens, because we're not on that information, we're not on that highway that we can't get off. We've hopefully got this broader sense of how we do that. And also, you know, many organizations, if that's going to be hard to do for you at the moment, it might be a case of developing a polymathic team. How do you have in your team, and how do you forge those connections and relationships even better, so that even if you haven't got the time to be a polymath and they haven't got the time to be a polymath, you've got that actually contained within your unit. It does help people to become more innovative and creative, because if you're thinking in that way, you are thinking consequentially, you're thinking much more creatively about the what ifs and how can we prepare for that. And you will, if you show that in yourself, encourage and inspire others to do the same. The fact that my friend went off to learn to be a painter was one of the things that actually was in my mind when I booked myself on an upholstery course. And another really big issue is automation and AI are on the rise. Whether or not we like it, there are some jobs that are going to be, consigned to things that can currently do things at a repetitive level. And whilst AI is developing in other areas, including in emotional intelligence, also so-called emotional intelligence, at the moment we need to be able to, in our businesses, to respond to some quite diverse sets of knowledge and skills that are being developed by AI, and to seize other opportunities. Anybody think of any other benefits of developing polymathic before we move on to the last 10 minutes? Any other benefits? I mean, there might be some more downsides going on in your head at the moment, and that's fine too. This isn't about you having to be one. It's about you, inviting you to think about this. Anyone think of any other benefits?
I think it's about making connections with concepts that might be seemingly disparate or lacking connection. Yeah. And therefore there's a sense that there's an ability to think laterally.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Anything else come to mind? Any other benefits for you or your business? Okay, next slide, please. So how to do this? Well, these are just my thoughts. These are not researched in any way at all. This is just what I've been thinking. So how do you become a bowl of fruit rather than a bunch of bananas? See it as a life's journey, not a final state. Realize everything is interconnected. Everything we do is interconnected. There's a fabulous video. I've given a link for you in the notes. It's called iPencil. It was made many years ago, and it's the journey of a lead pencil and all the different people and systems and countries that have resulted in this lead pencil that we throw away. It's absolutely fascinating. It's only 6 minutes. So begin to see that everything is interconnected. Where did this come from? Where is it going to? Where are we going to? Without needing to be attached to an outcome, I think. Pick up an interest you had as a child, perhaps one you dropped. How many of you have been thinking here, you know, I was really good at that at school. I really love doing that, and I'll do that when I retire. Don't wait to retirement. Develop that bit of your brain now, because you never know what's going to come out of developing that bit of your brain. We still have plasticity in our brains until we die. It decreases as we age and as we shrivel up. But if we can develop those things now, what did you give up that you used to love, that used to give you joy, put you in a state of flow, that you could pick up now? Next bullet, please. Develop new interests that use different aspects of you. I never wanted to do upholstery. I haven't actually picked it up for ages, but I've got other things now because I'm a polymath and I've gone somewhere else. But use different aspects of you. If you work all day with your hands, or you work in a thinking particular style, then use different aspects of you, your head and your hands and your heart, and you'll develop that more roundedness. And I do that through reading. I love podcasts, I watch videos, I go to talks, I go to courses. How can you build more of that into your life, and actually also build these things into how your organization and your team works? What can you do to develop everybody, give everyone the chance to develop their own little polymath You know, maybe have a polymath day once a quarter, where someone you pay for your team to go off and do something they've always wanted to do and haven't done before. Don't be afraid of not knowing. You know, embrace this discovery. Monomaths, if you are one or have monomath tendencies, there can be a desire to really know, and that's a very human desire for certainty. But if we embrace discovery and we reframe not knowing with, oh, how exciting, I might be discovering something new, I don't know where it's going to go, a bit like the thinking environment, being able to let go of predicting what someone's going to say and actually staying with the uncertainty of, oh, I wonder what they'll say if I just listen, where it will go. And challenge your own assumptions and replace them. If we're assuming I can't do that because I'm too busy, I can't do that because I've got time, I can't do that because it'll whatever, maybe we're thinking, maybe working with someone else in the group that you know to say, what am I assuming about not developing this aspect of me? Or and then replace it with, if I knew I could do that, I would X, Y, Z. Oh, went in the wrong order. That's really if you're neurodiverse or have someone in your team that is neurodiverse, or your family, don't assume you can't be a polymath. Actually, many polymaths are neurodiverse. Many of them are. But if you're not sure about someone, then the main thing to avoid really with someone who's neurodiverse is overwhelm. So, you know, encourage people to do one thing at a time. But, you know, flooding, it can be quite flooding of senses, flooding of choice can be, but, you know, really don't assume that you can't be a polymath if you're neurodiverse. And don't seek perfection, seek variety. And good enough is good enough. And that can be very hard when you're seeking to drive for quality and you're seeking to really be the best you can. But any of you that have come through an entrepreneurial route, which I think probably all of you have, will know that the idea of the MVP, you know, the minimum viable product, was what's good enough to get out there to see if this works, to test it, refine it, bring it back and adapt it. We all know the idea of alpha products and beta testing. So, you know, develop maybe that capacity in yourself. Next slide, please. And I think we might be, we're going to miss this next slide just for time and go to the next one. So this is going to be a takeaway question for you to think about either straight after here or in your own group is, how might polymath concepts be useful to you, your leadership and your team or your business in sustaining the capacity? So I thought what we'd do is just end on that really. Is to actually get some first thoughts about this that you can then take away and work more. So anybody like to kick off? How might these concepts be useful?
I mean, it stands to reason that anyone who's able to learn a variety of different skills is probably an apt and faster learner, so probably more adaptable and agile, like you mentioned initially, Linda. So I see that as a key part. Yeah,
wonderful. Yeah. Could your team benefit from taking some of these concepts in, or your company even? I mean, most companies have some specialization. How could it benefit, or could it put you at risk if you did?
I mean, one of the questions I wrote down to myself to think about was, you know, we talked about education systems. I think work systems are the same, that we're driven on this monomath pathway, and how you can enable growth of individuals through changing of specialization areas rather than the common sideways and backward step that we have to take to change. So I don't have an answer yet, but that's something that I want to look at for our business and particularly for the team.
Yeah. Absolutely. When I think of some of the businesses I worked with during COVID that really got through it well, they not only just moved online, they also said, well, given what's happening, what else can we do that uses some of what we've already got, that takes us in a different direction? And they're thriving.
Thinking about the team question, I'm really keen to instill a learning culture in our business because, you know, we're a service-based business, so we're all about just knowing stuff really and being able to practically apply it. But we also have individuals that have specific areas of expertise and specialisms, and you know they do need to have like a deep level of knowledge and be able to work at a greater level of detail. But something that I'm trying to encourage is for the individual specialists to educate each other, so they can layer on knowledge to their own area of expertise. So although it isn't, an email marketer being taught by an email marketer, it might be an email marketer being taught by a search engine optimization marketer. They can learn and apply new ideas and concepts to their own area of specialism through learning from a peer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And also something that I didn't put on the slides, but I think is very relevant there is the sustainability of your business. When you're a small business, if you've only got one expert that does one thing that no one else knows how to do, then that puts you in a position of potential risk. Whereas if you've got others that are cross-fertilizing, and I've worked with businesses that have come to an almost standstill when someone's been off sick or away or whatever, or someone's left, and all of the knowledge left with that one person because they had the deep knowledge they didn't share. So hopefully this idea as well will encourage people to share what they're learning and share what they know, so that they also gain that satisfaction of mentoring others, which is, for many a great satisfaction. Great. Well, I think we're done. So I would love to just invite you then. Thank you very much for this fantastic attention you've given me. You didn't get a lot of choice because I talked at you, but thank you very much. It's helped me to present to you. I would love to know, maybe in the chat box, what's one thing you've appreciated about this session? I don't mean about me. You can if you want to, but one thing you've appreciated or found useful about this time we've had, or something you might just want to go away and think about.
Dan's got a question.
Oh, Dan.
I can't find my chat box, so I just want to say thank you in voice. It's been very useful. And I'll try and find the chat box for the next breakout session.
Yeah, lovely.
It should be along the top.
Yeah.
Dan,
I can't see it there.
Have you got a leave button?
I've got a leave button.
And then to the left of that?
It says share.
And to the left of that, keep going.
I've got mic, camera, more, view, react, raise, and people, but I don't have a chat. It's all different to what it was last time, so I think it's updated, but not with the chat bit.
Is it not under the more little dots either?
No, sorry.
Oh well, thank you for your thanks, Dan.
That's all right. Thank you.
Let's hope you find the missing chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Has anybody else got that problem? Just a question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully, you'll be able to take this question. How might you apply these ideas for your next some thinking together? If you're doing a virtual walk and talk, or you've got some time now. So lovely. Diving more into a concept we take for granted in adaptability. Thank you very much. Yeah, I got very excited when I started researching this, and I got lost in it for several hours.
Okay.
Lovely.
So
thank you. We're coming up now to finish at 10:50. Thank you all. Love you. When you've got the chance after to give feedback to Jane and Elizabeth, that's always great to receive. What could I do definitely? What did you enjoy, and what changes would you make for another time? That'd be great.
Okay. Linda, thank you so much for exploring a subject probably a lot of us have, thought about, but not really actually given any real time to. So thank you for helping us open up that whole world of thinking slightly differently about various aspects. So thank you so much for that.